The world of Stillwater was a world of stone and silence, cradled in a granite bowl of mountains so high they seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. A single, treacherous road switchbacked down the valley wall, its ruts washed pale by rain, the only thread connecting the village to a distant, almost mythical elsewhere. There was no phone line, no television signal, only the wind in the pines and the slow, deep rhythm of a life cut off from time. Alara felt the change in her body before her mind could form the words for it. It was a subtle, internal shift, a wrongness in the familiar clockwork of herself. Her monthly courses, as regular as the moonrise over the eastern peak, had not come. A low, persistent nausea had taken root in her mornings, a queasy tide that rose with the smell of wood smoke and curing meat. Her breasts were tender, her senses strangely heightened, making the sharp scent of pine resin almost unbearable. She stood at the basin in her small cabin, washing her face with cold water from the pump, and her reflection in the rippling surface seemed to hold a secret she did not yet know. The realization did not arrive as a single crashing wave, but as a slow, chilling seep of dread. It filled the hollow spaces inside her, a cold weight settling deep in her womb. Pregnant. The word echoed in the quiet of her mind. A foreign and terrifying country. There was no joy in the discovery, only a quiet, suffocating panic. Who? The question was a void. Her memory offered only fog and shadow for the last few months, a blur of sameness broken by nothing but the turning seasons. She had to go to the village store for salt. The walk down the muddy path felt longer than ever, the eyes of the mountains upon her. In the cramped, dim store, Old Man Hemlock took her coin without meeting her gaze, his gnarled fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second too short. Outside, two women she had known since childhood, hanging laundry on a line, fell silent as she passed. Their conversation did not resume until she was several paces away, their hushed tones carrying on the thin air like the buzz of flies. No one said a word to her. No one asked after her health. But their averted eyes and the sudden, brittle quiet that followed her through the heart of the village were an accusation all their own. The first whisper of the storm had begun, and Alara was alone at its center. The silence in Stillwater was no longer a simple absence of sound. It had become a physical thing, a thick, cold mist that pressed against the windows of Alara's cabin and seeped under the door. Each day was heavier than the last, the weight of unspoken questions and averted gazes settling deep into the floorboards, which now seemed to creak with a new, accusatory tone. Alara tried to cling to the rhythms of her old life. She chopped wood, the axe biting into the pine with a solid, familiar thunk. She drew water from the pump, the iron handle cold and unyielding in her palm. But every task was performed under the watchful, silent judgment of the mountains that hemmed them in. The village, usually alive with the distant calls of children or the lowing of a cow, had gone preternaturally quiet. Even the jays were hushed. Her body was no longer her own. A subtle, firm curve had begun to harden below her navel, an undeniable truth her loose wool dresses could not yet conceal from her own knowing hands. The nausea came in waves, triggered by smells she once loved. The earthy scent of stewed roots, the sharp tang of her own sweat after labor. She moved through the cold, damp air of early autumn like a ghost, half in this world of suspicion, half trapped in the fog of her own mind. For there was a hole in her memory, a patch of darkness from months ago. Trying to grasp it was like trying to hold mist. It had been a night of thick, rolling fog, the kind that swallowed sound and shape whole. She had been returning from checking the trapline, the path a familiar ghost beneath her feet. Then a presence, not an animal. The memory offered no clear face, only sensory fragments that chilled her blood. The shock of cold hands on her skin, the smell of damp earth and pine needles crushed under a heavy weight, the blurred impression of a figure both familiar and utterly alien. A struggle, muffled by the fog, and then a deeper blackness, a void her mind refused to cross. She would jerk herself out of these half-dreams, her heart hammering against her ribs, her palms slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. The memory was a locked box, and she feared what she would find inside. The life growing within her was tied to that darkness, to that foggy encounter she could not fully remember, and the silence of the village told her they suspected it, too. They were waiting, and their silence was the loudest sound she had ever heard. The knock, when it came, was not loud, but it seemed to shake the very foundations of the small cabin. It was the sound of authority, of judgment, wrapped in the polite cadence of old knuckles on worn wood. Alara opened the door to find Morwen, the village elder, standing on her step. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of winter sky, pale and all-seeing. The cold mist of the afternoon clung to the wool of his heavy cloak. "Alara," he said, his voice a dry rustle like fallen leaves. "Might an old man come in from the damp?" She stepped aside, the silence in the room thickening with his presence. He moved slowly, his gaze taking in the humble room, the cold hearth, the neatly made bed, the single chair. He did not sit, but stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "The mountains are quiet today," he began, not looking at her. "Too quiet. The stones have a way of whispering when change is coming. They say the shadows grow longer this time of year, that they sometimes take a shape that walks." Alara said nothing. Her hands found the subtle, firm curve of her belly beneath her apron, a protective, unconscious gesture. Morwen's eyes finally settled on her, and they held no warmth. "There are old tales in these hills, girl. Tales of blood that goes crooked when it runs too long in the same channels. They say the land itself remembers the promises made to it, and demands a price for being kept pure." He took a step closer, and the scent of old wool and dried herbs filled the space between them. "A child is a blessing, but a child born of mist and mountain shadow, that is a different kind of growing. The folk are nervous. They speak of signs. A hare killed on the path with two heads. A spring that ran red for a day. They look at you, and they wonder what manner of father could leave no name, only a mark upon the mother." His words were not direct, but they coiled around her like smoke, each one laden with the weight of generations of suspicion. He was not asking for the truth. He was telling her the story the village had already decided upon. A story of tainted blood and curses, of a child that was less a blessing and more a reckoning for sins they had all agreed to forget. "The fog has a memory," Morwen said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "It holds onto things best left buried. Think on that, Alara. Think on what the mist might have brought you, and what it might yet take away." With that, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The silence he left in his wake was heavier than before, now filled with the echoes of old sayings and the grim certainty of the village's fear. Alara stood alone, the elder's words settling into her bones like a chill, wondering if the life inside her was a miracle or a sentence. The weight of Morwen's visit pressed on Alara long after he had gone. The cabin walls felt too close, the silence too accusing. She needed air, space, the simple truth of the forest. Pulling her shawl tight against the biting wind, she stepped outside and took the familiar path that skirted the village perimeter, where the ordered world of cottages and stone fences gave way to the wild, untamed woods. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the dense canopy of pine and fir, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. But the usual solace of the woods felt different today. The familiar sounds, the chatter of a squirrel, the distant cry of a hawk, seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Halfway along the trail, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the deeper woods to her left. Not the natural fall of a dead branch, but the distinct, deliberate snap of a heavy foot on a twig. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Her eyes scanned the dense undergrowth, but she saw nothing but shifting shadows and the steady drip of moisture from the needles overhead. The wind sighed through the high branches, but the underbrush remained still. Too still. She walked on, her pace quicker now, the skin on the back of her neck prickling. She was being watched. The sensation was a cold certainty, a pressure between her shoulder blades that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. Another rustle, this time to her right, a quick, furtive movement just beyond her line of sight. She spun around, her breath catching in white clouds, but there was only the silent, watching trees. A deep cold seemed to emanate from a patch of shadow beside a large granite outcrop, a pocket of air so frigid it made her shiver violently as she passed. It was a cold that felt ancient and purposeful. Her flight back toward the village was halted by a glint of something unnatural against the mossy base of an old oak. Cautiously, she approached. There, half hidden in a bed of brown ferns, was a small, crudely carved figure. It was a totem, fashioned from a dark, weathered piece of wood, its surface smoothed by time and countless handlings. It was no taller than her hand, shaped into a rough human form. Its face was a nightmare of slashed lines and gouges, and strange, angular symbols she did not recognize were carved into its torso and limbs. The wood was stained in patches with something dark and rusty, like old blood or rich, iron-heavy earth. It felt heavy, wrong. In her palm, a silent message left specifically for her. A warning or a claim. She dropped it as if it had burned her, her heart hammering, and ran the rest of the way home, the feeling of unseen eyes following her every step. Agnes arrived as dusk settled over Stillwater, a basket of bread and dried apples clutched in her hands like an offering. Her face, usually a mask of quiet endurance, was pale and drawn, the lines around her mouth deeper than Alara remembered. She did not meet her daughter's eyes as she stepped inside, her movements quick and nervous, as if the very walls of the cabin had ears. "I brought you something," she said, her voice low and hurried. She set the basket on the table but did not remove her shawl, as if ready to flee at a moment's notice. Her gaze darted to the window, to the darkening outline of the mountains. "The nights are drawing in early now." Alara watched her mother, the fear that had been a constant companion tightening its grip. "They are watching me, Mother." Morwen came. He spoke of crooked blood, of things buried. Agnes flinched as if struck. She finally turned, her eyes wide with a fear that went far deeper than village gossip. It was an old, ingrained terror, one that had been nursed in silence for decades. "Do not speak of such things, not even here," she whispered, her voice strained. "The walls are thin, and the past has long roots." She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached out but did not quite touch Alara's swelling abdomen. "My fear is not for their whispers, child. My fear is for what they do not know. What I have sworn never to tell." Her words were urgent, yet restrained, choked with a shame she could not give voice to. "This family, our history in this place. It is not what you believe. There are secrets in our blood, Alara. Secrets that should have stayed buried with the generations that came before us." She looked toward the door again, her posture rigid with the effort of holding back a flood of confession. "Your child," she began, then stopped, shaking her head. "There is a shadow that follows our line. A consequence of this place, of the choices made long ago to keep ourselves apart. I prayed it had ended. But it finds a way. It always finds a way." Her eyes, finally meeting Alara's, were filled with a desperate, protective love. But it was overshadowed by a dread so profound it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. "Be careful," she breathed, the words almost inaudible. "Trust no one, not even the stories you think you know. What is coming? It is older than their superstitions, and far more real." With that, she pulled her shawl tighter and slipped back out into the twilight, leaving behind the scent of fear and the chilling weight of a warning that explained nothing, yet promised everything terrible. Agnes's departure left a void in the cabin, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the heavy silence of her unspoken warnings. Alara stood frozen by the hearth, her mother's fear a contagion that had seeped into her own bones. The bread and apples sat untouched on the table, their ordinary presence a stark contrast to the extraordinary dread that now hung in the air. Hours later, long after the sun had vanished behind the mountains, a soft, hesitant knock came at the door. It was Agnes again, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes red-rimmed. She carried no basket this time, only a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders as if for armor. "I cannot leave you with only fear," she said, her voice raw. She did not wait for an invitation but stepped inside, moving to the fire and holding her hands out to its meager warmth. You deserve to know what you are facing, what your child may face. Alara said nothing, only watched as her mother gathered the courage of decades. Stillwater was not always a prison, Agnes began, her gaze fixed on the flames. It was a refuge. Our ancestors came here fleeing persecution, war, a world they found too chaotic. They found this valley, protected by the mountains, rich with game and clean water. They wanted to preserve their way of life, their purity. She took a shaky breath. But the mountains that protected them also trapped them. The outside world forgot we were here, and we forgot the outside world. Generations passed. Young men had to marry. Young women had to have children. There were no new faces, no new blood. The pool was too small. They began to marry their cousins. Second cousins at first. Then first. It was not done out of wickedness, Alara. It was done out of necessity. A desperate pact to survive, to keep the land within the families that had sworn to protect it. Her hands trembled. But the land, it exacts a price for such things. The children, they began to be born different. Not monsters, not the demons of Morwen's tales, but wrong. A stillness where there should have been a cry. A heart that beat too fast, then gave out. Fingers that were fused together like the petals of a strange flower. Minds that were bright and then, by 20, faded into fog, unable to recognize their own mothers. Agnes finally turned to look at Alara, her expression one of profound sorrow. It is a curse of our own making, a slow poison in the bloodline, passed down through the generations. We hid it, we cared for them in secret, loved them as best we could, and buried them quietly. We told outsiders they died of fever, of accidents. We told ourselves it was God's will, but it was our will that brought it upon us. Our choice to stay apart. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The confession hung between them, a history of shame and love and terrible sacrifice. It was not just a story. It was the truth of Alara's own blood, the explanation for the village's fear, and the terrifying inheritance she may have already passed to the life growing inside her. Agnes's voice dropped to a near whisper, the words thick with a grief worn smooth by years of silence. Your own grandfather, she said, the name catching in her throat. My father. He was one of them, a child of cousins who were themselves the children of cousins. She looked at her hands, as if seeing the bloodline mapped there. He was a beautiful baby, they said, but by his first year it was clear. His left hand, the fingers were webbed, fused together up to the first knuckle. A small thing perhaps to an outsider, but here it was a brand, a confirmation of the crooked blood. Alara felt the world tilt. The grandfather she remembered, a quiet, kind man who carved little birds from soft pine, had always worn gloves even in summer. She had thought it a quirk. He lived, Agnes continued, her tone flat, drained of emotion by the sheer weight of the recitation. He was lucky in a way, some were not. His own sister, your great-aunt you never knew, was born with a heart that was malformed. She lived only 3 weeks. There was a boy, 2 generations back, whose mind never developed past that of a young child. Another who was taken by seizures before he could walk. It is a roll call of sorrow, Alara. Not monsters, just flawed, broken by the same blood that made them. She looked up, her eyes pleading for understanding. The deformities are not always visible. Sometimes it is inside. A weakness in the organs. A tendency for the mind to unravel too soon. Early deaths. Sicknesses that should not take a strong young man. These have always haunted our line. And the others in this village. We are all bound by it. We all share the same tainted well. Agnes wrapped her arms around herself. A solitary figure bowed by the burden of truth. We hide it. We have always hidden it. We marry our cousins to keep the land, the tradition, and we pray the child will be whole. And when they are not, we love them, and we hide them, and we add another name to the secret ledger of our shame. She looked at Alara's belly, her expression a torment of love and terror. This child, conceived in the same closed circle. The risk is profound. It is not a curse from the mountain shadows. It is a curse of our own making, written in our very blood. And I am so afraid that I have passed it on to you, and you to them. The meeting was called at dusk, the time when shadows lengthened and fears grew teeth. The villagers gathered not in the warmth of a home, but in the cold, open space before the great hearth in the communal hall, a place usually reserved for celebrations and shared harvests. Tonight, it held no warmth. The air was thick with wood smoke and unspoken dread, each face illuminated by the flickering firelight, etched with lines of worry and ancient superstition. Alara did not sit among them. She stood near the back, pressed against the rough-hewn log wall, her shawl pulled tight. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. Morwen stood before the fire, his presence a dark pillar of authority. "We are not here to cast stones," he began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. "We are here to protect what is ours, our families, our future. The mountain shadows are stirring, and they bring with them a reckoning for old debts." A farmer named Gareth stood, his hands clenched at his sides. "It's the child," he said, his voice rough with fear, not malice. "Everyone knows it. Conceived in fog, fathered by a ghost. It's an ill sign. My own boy was born with a weak chest, coughs all winter. What if this thing she carries makes it worse? What if it draws the curse closer to all our doors?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, a chorus of shared anxiety. An older woman, Hester, who had lost 3 infants to unnamed fevers, spoke next. Her voice was thin but firm. "We cannot harbor a blight. For the good of the whole, the source must be removed. It is a mercy even for her. To raise such a child here, it would be a life of torment. Exile is a kindness compared to that." But not all voices were for casting her out. A younger man, Aled, whose own sister had been born with a crooked foot, stood slowly. "We speak of curses," he said, his voice hesitant. "But do we not share the same blood? My family's line is not clean. Who are we to say what is a curse and what is simply misfortune? To cast out one of our own for fear of what her child might be. It feels like we are condemning ourselves." His words were met with stony silence from some, but nods of grim acknowledgement from others. They were not arguing from a place of hatred, but from a deep, ingrained terror of the genetic lottery their isolation had forced upon them. Some advocated exile as a protective measure for the village. A few, like Aled, saw it as a hypocritical act that ignored their own complicity. Others argued it was for Alara's own good, to spare her and the child the certain misery of life in Stillwater. The debate swirled around her, fearful, pragmatic, and deeply conflicted. Alara stood silent, a statue in the storm of their fear. They were not a mob. They were a community fracturing under the weight of a secret they had all agreed to keep, now made manifest in her womb. The storm was not in the sky above them, but here in this room, and she was its eye. The morning after the gathering, a sharp rap at her door announced the midwife, Bridget. She was a stout, practical woman with eyes that had seen too much, her hands calloused from decades of delivering Stillwater's children into a world that did not always want them. She carried a leather satchel, its straps worn smooth. "Morwen sent me," she said, her voice devoid of warmth or judgment, simply stating a fact. The women insisted. "They want to know the state of things." Alara, her nerves frayed from the night before, could only nod and step aside. The cabin felt smaller with Bridget in it, the air thick with the scent of dried yarrow and something sharper, like vinegar. Bridget's examination was brisk, professional. Her cool, capable hands palpated Alara's abdomen, her expression unreadable. But as she worked, a frown began to crease her brow. She measured the fundal height with a marked string from her bag, then measured again, her movements slowing. "How far along do you believe you are?" she asked, her voice low. I cannot be certain," Alara whispered. The last bleeding was around the start of the harvest moon. Bridget's frown deepened. She placed a hollowed-out wooden tube against Alara's belly, putting her ear to the other end. She listened for a long time, her body utterly still. When she straightened, her face was pale. The professional mask slipped to reveal something colder beneath. "The size is advanced," she said, her words careful, precise. "Weeks ahead of what it should be for the timing you describe." She paused, choosing her next words with obvious difficulty. "And the heartbeat? It is too fast. A frantic hummingbird rhythm. Not like any I have heard before." She stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron, her gaze fixed on Alara's swollen middle with a look of dawning, horrified recognition. It was not the superstitious fear of the villagers. It was the cold, clinical fear of a healer who has seen a pattern repeat itself one too many times. "The movement, too," she murmured, almost to herself. "Not the gentle flutters of a babe turning. It is restless, agitated, as if it is fighting to be free of its own skin." She looked at Alara then, and her eyes were filled with a pity so profound it was worse than any accusation. She was not seeing a cursed abomination. She was seeing a medical tragedy she knew all too well. She was seeing the unmistakable, accelerated signs of a pregnancy where the blood had run too long in the same closed channel, where the genetic dice had been rolled with a loaded hand. "I have seen this before," Bridget said softly, the confession hanging in the air between them. "The rapid growth, the strange rhythms. It does not often end well." She packed her tools away with trembling hands, unable to meet Alara's eyes again. Her fear was not of a demon but of biology. She had delivered the webbed-fingered babies, the stillborns with malformed hearts, the children who would never speak. She knew the mark of the child, and in Alara's womb, she saw it written clearer and more terribly than ever before. She left without another word, her silence a more damning verdict than any village elder could have pronounced. The midwife's silent verdict hung in the cabin long after she had gone, a clinical confirmation of the village's superstitious dread. Alara felt trapped, the walls pressing in, the weight of the child, of its too fast heartbeat and restless growth. A constant, terrifying reminder. She could not sit still. She could not wait for the storm to break over her. If there were answers, they would not come from the fearful whispers outside her door. They were buried in this house, in the history her mother had only begun to unveil. A sudden, desperate need for clarity seized her. She took the oil lamp from the table and climbed the narrow, pull-down ladder to the attic, a space she had rarely visited, a realm of dust and forgotten things. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and thyme. The lamplight pushed back the shadows, revealing a landscape of memory. A broken spinning wheel, a trunk spilling yellowed linens, bundles of sage hanging from the rafters like sleeping bats. In the farthest corner, tucked beneath the steep slope of the roof, was an old sea chest, its iron bands rusted, its wood scarred and dark with age. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman known only as Morwenna, whose name was spoken rarely and always in a hushed tone. The latch gave way with a groan of protest. Inside, folded atop a pile of woolens that smelled of mothballs and cedar, was a journal. Its cover was of cracked leather, the spine reinforced with fraying twine. Alara lifted it out with reverent care, the weight of it feeling significant in her hands. Settling onto the dusty floorboards, she opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a watery brown. The handwriting was elegant but firm on the first pages, detailing the planting of crops, the births of lambs, the harsh beauty of the first winter in the valley. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew more frantic, the script becoming an uneven scrawl that slanted across the paper. Asterisk, the first snows came early. The store of potatoes is low. We are cut off. We must rely only on ourselves, on our own. The outside world is corruption. We must keep ourselves pure. We must keep the blood pure. It is the only way to hold the land star. Alara's breath caught. She turned another page. Asterisk, Anselm spoke to me today. He says his son must marry. There are no other young women of age but our Katrin and the Phelps girl. They are cousins, but what choice is there? The blood is strong. It will be fine. It must be fine. We cannot let outsiders in. They would take the land, dilute our ways. Purity is our shield, star. The entries became less about daily life and more about this single, consuming fixation. The word pure appeared again and again, a desperate mantra. Asterisk, the child came last night. A boy. He does not cry. His little hand. The fingers are like a duck's foot, fused together. Anselm says it is a sign of God's favor, a mark of our unique bond to this place. I see the midwife's eyes. She knows. This is the price. This is the price for the pure blood, star. Alara's hands trembled, holding the journal of a woman descending into a quiet madness, weaving a justification for a horror she could not face. The words were not those of a monster, but of a terrified woman trying to sanctify a terrible mistake, trying to spin a curse into a covenant. The foundation of Stillwater was not built on stone and faith alone, but on this, a frantic, fearful vow to keep the blood pure, no matter the cost. Alara turned the page, the paper whispering like a dry leaf. The ink here was darker, the pen pressed hard into the page, as if the writer sought to carve the words into existence. The elegant script of the early entries was gone, replaced by a jagged, hurried hand that spoke of sleepless nights and a mind fraying at the edges. Asterisk, the pact is made. All the founding families, Phelps, Hemlock, my own, we gathered at the standing stone under the full moon. We swore an oath on the soil of this valley, on the bones of our ancestors buried here. No one from beyond the mountains. No new blood. We marry within or not at all. We protect what is ours. We keep the line pure, star. The words were stark, absolute. It was not a suggestion or a tradition. It was a sworn covenant, a desperate strategy for survival in their stone-walled world. Morwenna's writing grew more fervent. Asterisk, it is the only way. The outside world is greed and sin. They would take our land, our ways, our children. They would dilute us until we are nothing, until Stillwater is just a name on a forgotten map. This is preservation. This is duty. The land demands it. The blood must remain ours alone, star. Alara could almost feel the woman's desperation, the twisted logic born of isolation and fear. The entries detailed the first unions arranged under the pact. Cousins marrying cousins, the celebrations muted, the matches practical and grim. There was no joy in the descriptions, only a grim satisfaction, a tally of obligations met. Asterisk, young Elwyn Phelps wed his second cousin, Angharad, today. A good match. The land stays within the families. The blood remains true. She is a strong girl. She will bear strong children. God would not allow a flaw in those who keep his covenant of separation, star. But the certainty began to crack. A few pages later, the writing was shakier, the ink blotted in places as if by tears. Asterisk, Angharad's child came early. A girl. She is small. So small. Her mouth is not formed right. A cleft in the palate that makes it hard for her to suckle. The midwife says she may not last the week. Angharad will not stop weeping. Elwyn will not look at it. This is God's test. It must be. Our faith is being tested. We must be stronger, star. The justification was there, but it was thinner now, stretched over a reality that was becoming impossible to ignore. The pact, forged in a fire of fear and defiance, was beginning to show its first, terrible flaw. The blood they had sought to keep pure was turning in on itself, and the journal of Alara's great-grandmother was the record of a woman watching her world's foundation slowly crumble, yet refusing to stop believing in it. The final pages of the journal were the most difficult to read. The handwriting, once so proud and firm, had deteriorated into a spidery, wavering script that crawled across the page, the letters often collapsing into one another. The ink was blotched and faded, as if the writer's hand had been unsteady, her vision clouded by tears or despair. Alara had to hold the lamp close, squinting to decipher the desperate, fading words. Asterisk, the child lives. God forgive us, it lives. It is a boy. They say he has his father's eyes. but I see only the truth in them. The truth of what we have done, star. The entry was stark, devoid of the fervent justification that had filled the earlier pages. The zeal was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching horror. Asterisk, his little body is wrong. Not in one way but in many. His legs are thin and twisted, unable to support him. His spine curves like a question mark. His cries are weak, mewling sounds that tear at the soul. The midwife would not meet my gaze. She knows. We all know. This is no test from God. This is the fruit of our oath. This is the purity we swore to protect, star. Alara's throat tightened. She could feel the ghost of her great-grandmother's anguish seeping from the brittle paper, a century-old grief that mirrored her own. Asterisk, Anselm and the other men gathered tonight. Their faces were like stone. They spoke of the pact, of the need to protect the families, the village. They spoke of the child as a thing, a manifestation of the crooked blood. They said it cannot be allowed to live among us, that its existence is a danger to the covenant, a sign of weakness that could unravel everything, star. The next entry was a single, heartbreaking sentence, scrawled across the page with a violence that had torn the paper. Asterisk, my grandson, my own blood. They are taking him to the high caves tonight, star. The final entry was written in a hand so faint it was almost invisible. Alara had to tilt the page to the lamplight to make out the words. Asterisk, he is gone. The cradle is empty. Anselm says it is for the best. That the mountain will care for him now. That it is a mercy. The silence in this house is a living thing. It is eating me from the inside out. I hear his cries on the wind. I have sanctified a monster, and the monster was us, star. The journal ended there. Alara slowly closed the cover, her hands numb. She saw not a monster in her mind's eye, but a tiny, broken infant, carried away into the cold and the dark by men who believed they were saving their world by sacrificing their own. The child was not hidden out of shame for what it was, but out of shame for what they had done to create it. The pact to preserve their land and tradition had demanded its first, terrible payment, and her family had been the ones to pay it. The weight of that legacy settled upon her, heavier and more real than ever before. The life inside her kicked, a restless, frantic movement, and for the first time Alara felt not just fear, but a crushing generation's deep sorrow. The journal's final, damning words seemed to have seeped into the very air of the cabin, a chill that no fire could dispel. Alara descended from the attic, the weight of her great-grandmother's grief a stone in her chest. The child within her stirred again, that same restless, agitated movement that felt less like life and more like a frantic struggle. She needed to get out, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the dust of 100 years of shame. Pulling her shawl over her head, she stepped outside. A thick, gray mist had rolled down from the high peaks, swallowing the world in a damp, sound-muffling blanket. It was the same kind of fog from the hole in her memory, and a fresh wave of nausea, unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. The village was invisible, its sounds deadened. She was utterly alone in a world of shifting gray. She walked without purpose, her feet carrying her along the familiar path that led toward the tree line. The mist clung to her clothes, beaded on her eyelashes, and filled her lungs with its cold, damp weight. The journal's horror played behind her eyes. The twisted infant, the grim-faced men, the high, lonely caves. A movement. She froze, her breath catching. There, at the very edge of the woods where the mist was thickest, a shape resolved itself from the gray. It was a hunched silhouette, darker than the surrounding gloom, standing perfectly still among the skeletal trees. It was man-shaped, but wrong. The posture was slumped, one shoulder sitting higher than the other, giving the figure a broken, asymmetrical outline. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the eerie quiet. She took an involuntary step back, her boots scraping softly on a wet stone. The figure did not move. It simply stood, a sentinel in the mist, watching her. She could discern no features, no face, just the vague, disturbing impression of a head tilted at an angle. It was the hidden relative from the journal-given form, a ghost from her family's cursed past made manifest in the present. A cold deeper than the mountain air seeped into her bones. This was no animal, no trick of the light. This was what her family had created and then abandoned. This was the consequence of the pact, standing 50 paces away, silent and watching. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the figure turned. The movement was not smooth but had a stiff, limping quality. It retreated into the deeper shadows of the pines, its form dissolving back into the mist until there was nothing left but the swirling gray and the pounding of Alara's own terrified heart. The encounter had lasted mere seconds, but the image of that hunched, limping shape was burned into her mind forever. The secret was no longer buried in a journal. It was here, and it was watching. Alara did not run. The terror that had frozen her blood at the sight of the figure in the mist now crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. She turned from the woods and walked back to her cabin, her steps measured, her mind a whirlwind of journal entries and her mother's fearful confessions. The pieces were there, jagged and ugly, and they all pointed to one person: Agnes. Her mother, the keeper of secrets, the architect of silence. She found Agnes by her own hearth, mending a wool sock, her hands moving with a nervous, repetitive rhythm. She looked up as Alara entered, and her face, already pale, went ashen at the sight of her daughter's expression. A mask of grim determination, not fear. "The high caves, mother?" Alara said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet of the room. She did not sit. She stood before Agnes, an accuser and a daughter fused into one. The child born to Morwenna, the one they took away. He didn't die, did he? Agnes's hands stilled. The darning needle slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the stone hearth. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, pleading, trapped. "I found the journal," Alara pressed, the words sharp and precise. "I read what they did, and I saw him, just now, at the tree line, watching me, a man, hunched and broken. How long, mother? How long has our family been hiding one of its own in the mountains?" The dam broke. A terrible, shuddering sob racked Agnes's body. The careful composure she had maintained for decades shattered into 1,000 pieces. She crumpled forward, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of a grief and guilt too long suppressed. "His name was Aaron," she choked out, the words muffled by her hands. "He was my uncle. Your great uncle." She looked up, her face ravaged by tears, years of concealed anguish finally erupting. "They said he was simple, that his body was too twisted to live among people. But he wasn't simple, Alara. He was gentle. He loved the birds. He could mimic every call." She drew a ragged breath, the confession pouring out of her now, a torrent that could no longer be stopped. "My father, your grandfather, he was charged with it, with taking him food, checking on him. And when my father's own mind began to fog, when he could no longer remember the path, the duty fell to me. For 40 years, Alara. 40 years I have climbed to that shack in the high rocks. 40 years I have brought him blankets and bread and whispered that he was not forgotten, that his family still loved him." She wept openly now, the weight of her secret finally too heavy to bear alone. "The village must never know. The pact, the shame, it would destroy us. We are all guilty. We have all played a part in this preservation of our cursed bloodline. We hide our flaws, we bury our mistakes, and we pretend the mountain shadows are to blame instead of our own choices." Alara stood motionless, her anger cooling into a stunned, hollow ache. She had wanted the truth, but the reality of it, the decades of lonely vigil, the hidden relative, the systemic, generations-deep complicity, was far heavier and more sorrowful than she had imagined. Her mother was not a villain. She was a prisoner of the same legacy, a caretaker of a living ghost, and the weight of it had bowed her into the ground. The confrontation was over. There was no fight left, only the devastating shared knowledge of what their family and their village had truly become. 3 days after the confrontation they came, not as a mob but as a delegation. A solemn, grim-faced procession of the village elders, led by Morwen. They arrived at her cabin at the precise hour of noon, when the weak autumn sun was at its highest, as if to banish any shadow of doubt or mercy from the proceedings. They did not knock, but simply stood in a semicircle before her door, their postures rigid, their faces carved from the same granite as the mountains that loomed behind them. Alara opened the door, her heart a cold, still weight in her chest. She had known this was coming. The silence of the past few days had been the calm before the sentencing. Morwen stepped forward. He held no staff of office, carried no weapon. His authority was in his age, in the collective will of the silent men and women flanking him, the heads of the Phelps, Hemlock, and Vaughn families. Their expressions were not cruel, but resolute, etched with a fear that had calcified into certainty. "Alara," Morwen began, his voice devoid of its usual parables, stripped down to a cold, formal pronouncement. "The village has spoken. We have debated and prayed upon this matter. The child you carry is a danger, not from malice but from its very nature. Its blood is too crooked, its origin too shadowed. To allow it to be born among us would be to invite the full weight of the legacy we have long struggled to bear. It would be a constant reminder of the pact and its cost, a living embodiment of a truth we cannot face." He paused, his wintry eyes holding hers. There was no hatred in his gaze, only a terrible, weary finality. "We do not make this choice lightly. For the good of the community, and for whatever peace you might find elsewhere, you are given an ultimatum." One of the other elders, a woman named Bronwyn with hands permanently stained from dyeing wool, spoke next, her voice thin but clear. "You will leave the Valley of Stillwater before the first snow settles on the peaks." She gestured to the mountains, their highest tips already dusted white. "You will take nothing that binds you to this place. You will tell no one of your origin or your destination. You will be as a ghost, and this chapter will be closed." Morwen took up the thread again, his tone becoming almost ritualistic. "If you choose to stay, if the child is born within our boundaries, you will both be shunned. No one will speak to you. No one will trade with you. No hand will be raised to help you, in birth or in life. You will be ostracized utterly, and the child will be deemed an abomination, a thing of ill omen to be avoided until the mountains claim you both. There will be no place for you here. Not ever." The words hung in the cold air, a death sentence for her life in Stillwater. They offered exile as a perverse kindness, a chance to spare them all the ugly reality of the birth. They were not monsters. They were terrified people, choosing the survival of their fragile, insular world over the fate of one young woman and her tragically conceived child. "The first snow will come within the fortnight," Morwen said, his final words dropping like stones. "The choice is yours. Leave before it falls, and you may go with a measure of our pity. Stay, and you remain only with our fear." With that, they turned as one and walked away, their footsteps silent on the damp earth. They left behind no sound, no further argument, only the stark, simple terms of her banishment. Alara stood in the doorway, watching them go, the cold autumn wind biting at her cheeks. The mountains, her lifelong guardians, now felt like the walls of a prison whose door had just been opened, revealing only a vast and terrifying unknown. The elders' ultimatum echoed in the silence they left behind, a cold, formal decree that stripped the future of all its possibilities. Before the first snow, Alara stood in her doorway, watching their retreating backs until they were swallowed by the mist that perpetually clung to the village. The mountains, once a familiar embrace, now felt like the jaws of a trap about to snap shut. Exile or utter isolation, a choice between two kinds of death. But the journal's words and the hunched figure in the mist had planted a third option in her mind. Not an escape, but a confrontation. If she was to be cast out for knowing the truth, she would have all of it. She would look the family's hidden shame in the face before she was forced to flee from it. Waiting until the deep quiet of the afternoon, when the village was shut indoors against the damp, Alara wrapped her heaviest shawl around her shoulders and slipped out. She did not take the path toward the village, but the one that led up, away from it, into the rugged foothills that cradled Stillwater. This was the way her mother had vaguely alluded to for 40 years. The way to the high caves. The climb was arduous, the path little more than a goat track strewn with loose scree. The air grew thinner, colder. Patches of old, granular snow lay in the shadows of rocks. Her body, heavy and unbalanced with the restless child, protested every step, but a grim determination drove her forward. The journal's description of a shack in the high rocks guided her, and after an hour of painful ascent, she saw it. It was less a shack and more a lean-to, cobbled together from weathered planks and slabs of stone, built into a natural recess in the cliff face. It was almost invisible, camouflaged against the granite. Smoke, thin and gray, curled from a makeshift chimney pipe. Someone was home. Her heart hammered not just from the climb. This was it, the secret keeper, the living proof of the pack's cost. She approached slowly, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. Before she could call out, the rough-hewn door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim interior. He was hunched, one shoulder significantly higher than the other, forcing his neck into a perpetual tilt. It was the figure from the mist. But up close, he was not a monster. He was simply a man, old and worn, his face a landscape of deep wrinkles and a life lived in hardship. His clothes were patched but clean. His hands, curled slightly with what might have been mild contractures, were clean. His eyes, however, were what held her. They were the same shade of gray as her own, as her mother's. They were intelligent, alert, and filled with a deep, weary sadness. They watched her not with threat, but with a profound and knowing recognition. "Alara," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but clear and articulate. There was no madness in it, only a resonant sorrow. "I wondered when you would come. I am Silas, your mother's brother." He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter his humble shelter. The movement was stiff, his gait uneven, but deliberate. The deformities were physical, a testament to the crooked blood, but his mind was sharp, his presence calm. He was not the feral creature of village legend, but a man, her uncle, hidden away not because he was dangerous, but because his existence was inconvenient to the story Stillwater told itself. The interior of the lean-to was surprisingly orderly, though Spartan. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, neatly made with a worn wool blanket. A small, well-swept hearth held a low fire, over which a pot of stew simmered. Dried herbs hung from the low ceiling, and a few carefully whittled bird figurines. A jay, a sparrow, sat on a crude shelf. This was not the den of a beast, but the home of a solitary, thoughtful man. Silas motioned for her to sit on a stool by the fire. He took the cot, his body settling into its accustomed, tilted posture with a soft sigh. He watched her, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. Her advanced pregnancy, the fear and resolve warring in her expression. "Agnes, my sister. She has been good to me," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A difficult duty, carried with more love than I had any right to expect. She brought me your father's old books, taught me to read them herself on her visits. It made the solitude manageable." Alara could only stare, the image of her mother making the secret climb for decades, reshaping everything she thought she knew about her. "The village believes the child's father is a ghost, a spirit of the mist," she said, the words tasting like ash. "But it was a man, wasn't it?" Silas nodded slowly, a gesture of deep regret. "I know who he is. I have always known. I watch from the high rocks. I see the comings and goings. I see the patterns repeat." He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his sad eyes. "It was a man of this village, a man who shares our blood, many times over. A distant cousin, like nearly all here." He looked back at her, his expression grim. "He sought you out on the night of the great fog. He believed it was his duty, his right, a twisted sense of obligation, passed down through the whispered secrets of his own family." Alara's blood ran cold. "Duty? The pact is not just history, Alara. It is a living, breathing sickness for some, Silas explained, his voice heavy with disdain. There are those who still believe in it fervently, who see the dwindling numbers, the weakening stock, and think the answer is not new blood, but a doubling down on the old ways. They believe the blood must be concentrated, not diluted, that a strong union within the closest allowable degrees will produce a strong child, a pure heir to the land. It is a desperate, foolish pride, a belief that they can fix the mistakes of the past by repeating them with more conviction. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. He saw you, healthy and young, of direct lineage from a founding family. He saw the fog that night as a sign, a blanket to conceal the act. He believed he was saving the bloodline, continuing the tradition. He did not see it as a violation, but as a sacred responsibility, a duty to Stillwater. The revelation landed like a physical blow. It was not a random act of violence born of malice, but something colder, more calculated, and far more tragic. Her child was not conceived by a monster or a ghost, but by a man poisoned by the same legacy that had created Silas, a man who thought he was performing a perverse act of patriotism for a dying world. The father was a product of the very curse he sought to fix. Silas's words hung in the close, smoky air of the lean-to, each one a weight settling deeper into Alara's soul. The fire crackled, a mundane sound in the face of the monstrous truth. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an animal or a spirit. It was a man she knew, a man she had seen every market day, heard laugh at gatherings, watched swing a hammer at his forge. The violation was not anonymous. It was intimate, a betrayal woven into the very fabric of her world. Who? The word was a whisper, torn from a place of raw dread. Silas held her gaze, his own filled with a pity that was almost unbearable. Caius, he said, the name dropping into the silence like a stone. The blacksmith. Caius. Big, broad-shouldered Caius, with his easy smile and hands that could shape iron as easily as they could cradle a newborn lamb. A distant cousin, yes, everyone was, but a respected man. A pillar of the community. The image of him, his familiar face superimposed over the blurred, cold-handed memory of the foggy night, made her stomach lurch. He is a Vaughn on his mother's side, Silas continued, his voice low and steady. And his grandmother was a Phelps. The bloodlines are tangled, but they lead back to the same few families, the same founding pact. He carries the belief like a religion, thinks the old ways are the only ways, thinks strength comes from doubling down, not branching out. He shifted on his cot, the movement stiff. I've heard him talking to others at the forge, men who share his fears. They speak of weak blood and strong seed. They see the stillbirths, the early graves, and they think the solution is to try harder within the lines we've drawn. They call it keeping the legacy pure. They see it as their duty to the founders, to the land itself. Silas's eyes drifted to the small, whittled birds on his shelf. He is not a cruel man, Alara. Not in his heart. That is the true horror of it. In his mind, he was not defiling you. He was honoring you, choosing you to bear a child that would be a testament to Stillwater's endurance. He believed the fog was providence, a veil for an act he knew the wider village might not understand, but one he felt was necessary for our survival. He looked back at her, his expression grim. And he bears the mark himself, though few would see it. The little finger on his left hand is crooked, bends inward toward the palm. A small thing, but a thing. He sees it not as a flaw but as a badge, a sign of his pure blood. He thought he was giving you a gift, a child of the truest stock. The revelation was complete. The father was not a monster from a folktale, but a man warped by the very history that had created him. His was a crime of twisted love for a dying ideal, a violent act performed in the name of preservation. The child in her womb was not a cursed abomination, but the tragic, predictable outcome of a generation's deep sickness of the mind, passed down as faithfully as the webbed fingers and weak hearts. Caius had not been continuing a tradition. He had been perpetuating a pathology, and she was its living, breathing consequence. The truth of Caius was a sickness in itself, a cold rot that settled in Alara's core as she made the treacherous descent from Silas's lean-to. The sky, which had been a flat, leaden gray all day, began to bruise into deeper shades of purple and black. The wind, once a sigh, sharpened into a moan that whipped through the pines, tearing the last brittle leaves from the oaks. The first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the stone path with the sound of stones hitting water. By the time she reached her cabin, the storm had broken in earnest. It was not a gentle autumn rain, but a violent, thrashing deluge. Wind screamed around the eaves, driving sheets of water against the windows. Thunder, when it came, was not a distant rumble but a sudden, deafening crack that seemed to split the sky directly above the valley, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. The mountains, usually steadfast sentinels, vanished behind a wall of gray fury. The single road out was now a torrent of mud and runoff, utterly impassable. Stillwater was isolated, cut off from even the possibility of the outside world, trapped with its secrets and its gathering dread. Inside, Alara tried to light a lamp, but her hands were trembling too violently. The storm outside mirrored the one within her. The revelation of Caius, his twisted sense of duty, his warped belief, played over and over in her mind. The child, his child, moved inside her, not with the gentle flutters of the past months, but with a series of hard, frantic kicks, a painful, rhythmic clenching low in her belly that was entirely new and terrifying. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the door, and a searing pain, bright and white, tore through her abdomen, doubling her over. She gasped, clutching the table for support as a wave of nausea washed over her. The pain ebbed, then returned seconds later, stronger, a vice tightening around her spine and womb. There was no mistaking it. It was too early, weeks too early, but her labor had begun. As another peal of thunder shook the cabin, a different sound echoed through the storm, the frantic, urgent clanging of the village alarm bell, its usually clear tone distorted by the wind. It was not a call to meeting. It was a sound of panic. Through the rain-lashed window, she saw lanterns, dozens of them, bobbing toward her cabin like malevolent fireflies through the gloom. The villagers, trapped and terrified by the storm's fury, saw her premature labor not as a natural event, but as a cataclysm they had predicted. The child, conceived in a storm of human failing, was choosing to enter the world amidst a storm of nature's rage. They saw it as an omen, the long-dreaded doom finally breaking upon them, and they were coming to witness the reckoning. The storm was a living thing, a roaring beast that battered the small cabin, its fury seeping through every crack and seam. The wind shrieked, a high, mad sound that drowned out Alara's own ragged breaths. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 frantic fists, and with each peal of thunder, the single oil lamp on the table flickered wildly, casting leaping, monstrous shadows on the walls. Inside, the world had shrunk to a circle of pain and terror. Alara was on her bed, her body no longer her own but a vessel racked by a force as primal and untamable as the tempest outside. The contractions came not in waves, but as relentless, grinding seizures that seized her spine and abdomen, stealing the air from her lungs. It was too soon. The child was fighting its way into the world weeks early, as if it too could sense the closing walls of its fate and was desperate to escape. She was not alone. Brigid, the midwife, was there, her face a mask of grim concentration in the unstable light. Her capable hands were steady, but her eyes, whenever they flickered up from her work, held a deep, professional dread. She had seen labors like this before, precipitous, violent, unnatural in their urgency. She knew what it often foretold. Alara's mother, Agnes, knelt by the bedside, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched her daughter's hand, her lips moving in silent, frantic prayers that were torn away by the howl of the wind. Her fear was a tangible presence in the room, a second specter beside the pain. Outside, the world was a tableau of collective anxiety. The villagers had gathered, not as a mob, but as a silent, rain-drenched congregation. They stood in the muddy yard, their lanterns held high, their faces pale ovals of fear in the gloom. They did not shout or threaten. They simply watched the lit window, their postures rigid, their silence more accusing than any curse. The storm was an omen, and the premature birth happening within was its terrible fulfillment. They were witnesses to a judgment they had all, in their way, called down upon themselves. Another contraction ripped through Alara, a white-hot agony that arched her back off the bed. A cry was torn from her throat, a raw sound that was swallowed by the boom of thunder that followed instantly, shaking the cabin to its foundations. The lamp guttered, and for a terrifying second, the room was plunged into near darkness, save for the periodic blue-white flash of lightning that illuminated the terrified faces within and the silent, waiting crowd without. Bridget leaned closer, her voice a low, urgent murmur against Alara's ear. "The babe is coming. Now, push." The command was barely audible over the storm's roar. Alara's world narrowed to the imperative, to the crushing pressure and the primal need to expel the life within her into a world that had already condemned it. She pushed, her scream joining the symphony of the storm, a sound of utter extremity. The villagers outside leaned forward as one, their fear a palpable force in the stormy air, waiting for the revelation of the child that was either their salvation or their damnation. Alara pushed with a strength born of primal instinct, a force that tore through the pain and terror. The world dissolved into a roaring, red-hazed tunnel where nothing existed but the imperative to expel, to be free of the agony that had claimed her body. Agnes's hand was a crushing vice around hers, her whispered prayers lost in the cacophony of the storm and Alara's own ragged cries. Then, a final, searing release. A sudden, shocking emptiness. Silence. For a heart-stopping moment, there was no sound but the relentless hammering of rain on the roof and the howl of the wind. Bridget moved quickly, her hands a blur of practiced motion. Alara, panting and drenched in sweat, strained to see, to hear the cry that would shatter the awful quiet. A sound came, but it was not the robust wail of a newborn. It was a thin, reedy gasp, a mewling struggle for air that was barely audible over the storm's fury. Bridget had the child. She wiped its face with a clean cloth, her movements efficient but slowing as she examined the infant in the flickering lamplight. Her professional mask, already cracked, shattered completely. Her face, usually so composed, paled. A soft, horrified breath escaped her lips, a sound more terrifying than any curse. Alara pushed herself up on her elbows, her body screaming in protest. "My baby! Let me see my baby!" Bridget did not immediately hand the child over. She was staring, transfixed by the small form in her hands, her eyes wide with a dread that was medical, tangible, and deeply personal. She had delivered the webbed fingers, the cleft palates, the weak-limbed babies of Stillwater. She knew the signs, the spectrum of the bloodline's failings. But this was more pronounced, more concentrated. When she finally turned, her movements were stiff with shock, and she laid the swaddled infant in Alara's waiting arms. The child was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid flutters. But its features, Alara's breath caught. The tiny face was asymmetrical, one eye socket sitting noticeably lower than the other. The palate was severely cleft, a deep fissure that made the mewling cries sound wet and strained. As the blanket shifted, she saw the hands, tiny, star-shaped things where the fingers were fused together almost to the tips, lacking distinct digits. The legs, even in their swaddling, seemed too thin, the feet turned inward at a weak, unnatural angle. It was not a monster from a fireside tale. It was a child, a living, breathing infant. But it was a child upon whom generations of isolation and genetic decay had written their history in the starkest possible terms. The profound inbreeding, the culmination of the pack's terrible logic, was manifest in every tiny, flawed feature. Bridget took a step back, her hand rising to her mouth. Her horror was not born of superstition, but of cold, clinical recognition. She had seen the pattern before, but never so clearly, so devastatingly illustrated. This was the bloodline curse made flesh, and the sight of it, even for her seasoned eyes, was a visceral blow. She looked from the child to Alara's stunned, heartbroken face, and her own eyes filled with tears, not of fear for the village, but of pity for the mother and the tragically marked life she now held. The thin, reedy cries of the infant were a fragile counterpoint to the storm's dying rage. Outside, the wind had lost its scream, subsiding into a sullen moan. The rain softened to a steady, dismal patter. The lanterns of the villagers, which had been held like a ring of accusing eyes, now wavered and began to disperse as the initial superstitious fervor broke against the stark, human reality within the cabin. But the silence they left behind was not peaceful. It was heavy, charged with a new and different kind of dread. Bridget, her professional composure slowly returning, moved to clean the child and attend to Alara with hands that still trembled slightly. Her actions were methodical, but her face remained pale, her gaze avoiding the infant's features as much as possible. The medical reality was too profound to ignore. Agnes wept silently by the bedside, her tears now for the living child, for the future her daughter faced, for the crushing weight of a legacy that had culminated in this tiny, flawed form. She touched the baby's head with a trembling finger, a gesture of love overshadowed by an immense, generation's deep sorrow. The door, which had been left ajar in the frantic moments of the birth, creaked open. A few of the villagers had not left. They stood on the threshold, their faces stark in the gray dawn light filtering through the breaking clouds. They had come expecting a monster, an omen, a thing of legend. They saw a mother, exhausted and pale, cradling a newborn. They saw a child that was small, frail, and bore the unmistakable, heartbreaking marks of their shared history. Gareth, the farmer, was the first to break the silence. His face, which had been set in lines of fear, now twisted with a different, uglier emotion, revulsion. "Look at it," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Look what the crooked blood has made. It's an abomination. You shouldn't draw breath. It's a mercy to—" He didn't finish the thought, but the meaning hung in the air, cold and brutal. A murmur of agreement rippled through the small group at the door. The fear had curdled into a hard, pragmatic cruelty. They saw the child not as an innocent, but as a symbol of everything they feared in themselves, a living accusation they could not bear. But then a voice cut through the grim consensus. It was Aled, the young man who had spoken at the gathering. He pushed his way to the front, his face ashen but his jaw set. "Mercy?" he said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and conviction. "You call that mercy? Look at it, Gareth. Truly look. It's a baby. It's alive. It's done nothing but be born into the world we made for it." He turned to face the others, his gaze sweeping over them. "Our fear made those rules. Our choices shaped that blood. That child is no demon. It is the most innocent thing in this valley. It is the product of our silence, our secrets, our purity. To call for its death is to condemn ourselves." His words shamed a few. Hester, the woman who had advocated for exile, looked away, her expression conflicted. Others remained hardened, their faces closed. The village was thrown into a chaos not of action, but of conscience. The ultimatum of exile was now complicated by the raw, vulnerable reality of the child itself. Some, shamed by the truth Aled voiced, saw not a cursed thing but a tragic consequence, and a fragile, desperate need to protect Alara and her baby from the hardened hearts of their neighbors. The storm had passed, but the schism it revealed within Stillwater was deeper and more dangerous than any tempest. The gray dawn light did nothing to soften the harsh reality in the cabin. The air, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the damp chill of the receding storm, was now charged with a new tension. The silent, brutal schism between those who saw a monster and those who saw a tragic consequence. The villagers on the threshold finally dispersed, their arguments hushed but unresolved, leaving behind a silence that was somehow louder than their fear. It was into this fraught quiet that Morwen returned. He did not come with the formal procession of elders, but alone, his steps slow and heavy, as if the short walk from his home had cost him dearly. He stood in the doorway, his ancient frame outlined against the lightning sky, his gaze taking in the scene. The exhausted mother, the weeping grandmother, the pragmatic midwife, and the swaddled infant whose very existence was a question the village could not answer. He did not look at the child directly. Instead, his eyes, pale and weary, settled on Alara. There was no judgment in them now, only a profound and terrible exhaustion. "The storm has passed," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "But it has left its mark, as storms always do." He moved further into the room, his movements stiff. He did not sit, but stood by the cold hearth, as he had on his first visit, though now the authority had bled from him, leaving only a husk of a man bowed by the weight of years and complicity. "You asked for truth, girl," he said, not to Alara alone, but to the room, to the very history that saturated the walls. "And truth, like a sharp stone, cuts the hand that holds it. You have been shown the sharpest edge of it." He sighed, a long, rattling breath. "The child is not a curse. It is a receipt, a bill come due for a debt we have been accruing for generations. We called it keeping the blood pure, we called it preserving our ways, we used pretty words to dress a ugly thing. It was fear. Fear of the outside. Fear of change. Fear of losing what little we had clawed from this stone valley." His gaze finally drifted to the bundle in Alara's arms, and a spasm of pain crossed his face. "We are all guilty, every soul in Stillwater. We turned our faces from the webbed fingers and the weak hearts. We whispered God's will, and buried our shame in unconsecrated ground. We married our cousins and prayed the dice would fall in favor of wholeness, and when they did not, we hid the evidence away in the high rocks or in early graves. We built our peace on a foundation of silent, collective sin." He looked at Agnes, at her tears. "We tasked mothers and sisters with the keeping of our secrets, making them guardians of the very shame that was ours to bear. We let tradition become a cage, and we called it protection." His voice grew even softer, filled with a bitter regret. "Caius, his act was not an aberration. It was the logical, twisted end of the path we laid down. He is a product of this system, a man who learned too well the lessons of blood and duty we taught. He believed he was strengthening the line, fulfilling a purpose we had all, through our silence, endorsed." Morwen looked back at Alara, his expression one of utter defeat. The legacy of Stillwater is not in its stone walls or its ancient names. It is in this, in the choices we made to stay apart, and the terrible price we have paid, and will continue to pay for that isolation. We are not cursed by the mountain shadows. We are cursed by our own fear, and that is a legacy far heavier than any child. He had come not to condemn or to comfort, but to confess, to place the guilt not on an individual, not on Caius, not on Alara, not on the child, but on the entire village, himself at the forefront. He was the elder, the keeper of the stories. He had wielded the parables of crooked blood and whispering stones to maintain order, to keep the secret. Now he laid the full, ugly truth at their feet. The legacy was not a thing of the past. It was a living, breathing sickness they had all nurtured, and the child in Alara's arms was its most undeniable symptom. The silence after Morwen's confession was absolute, broken only by the infant's shallow, struggling breaths. The elder's words had sucked the air from the room, leaving behind the cold, hard truth of collective guilt. It was into this void that a new presence intruded. A shadow fell across the doorway. Caius stood there, his broad frame filling the space, his face ashen and stripped of its usual easy confidence. He did not look at the child. His eyes, wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension, were fixed on Alara. He had heard. He had heard Morwen lay bare the rotten foundation of their world, and his own role in it. He stepped inside, his movements heavy, like a man walking to his own gallows. The villagers who had lingered outside parted for him, their expressions a mix of revulsion and a strange, grim pity. He stopped a few feet from the bed, his powerful blacksmith's hands hanging limp at his sides. His voice, usually so strong and sure, was a ragged scrape. I believed. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at Morwen, a desperate plea for validation in his eyes, but found only weary condemnation. He looked at the child, a swift, terrified glance that took in the cleft palate, the tiny, fused hands, and then flinched away as if struck. "The blood must be strong," he whispered, echoing the old, twisted mantra. It sounded hollow now, pathetic. "The Von line," my grandfather said, "we are the backbone. We must fortify the stock. It was my duty, my right." The fog. It was a sign, a blessing to conceal the sacred act. He was begging them to understand his warped logic, to see the nobility in his violation. But the words, spoken aloud in the clear, cold light of dawn with the child as evidence, were monstrous. His duty was a crime. His sacred act was a violent assault born of a poisoned ideology. He fell to his knees on the rough plank floor, the impact a dull thud. His shoulders, usually so straight and proud, slumped in utter defeat. He looked up at Alara, his eyes streaming with tears of shame and a broken, twisted love. "Forgive me," he choked out, the words raw and desperate. "Before God, Alara, forgive me. I thought I was saving us. I thought I was giving you a hero, a pure son of Stillwater. I did not see. I did not know it would be." His gaze flickered to the child again, and a sob racked his body. He could not finish the sentence. He could not name the reality of what his duty had created. The physical proof of his actions, the living, breathing, tragically deformed infant, was a truth his fervent beliefs could not withstand. "The damage is done," Morwen said softly, not to Caius, but to the room. His words were not an absolution, but a final, grim pronouncement. "Your loyalty was to a ghost, Caius, to a tradition that was never anything but fear wearing a mask of honor. You sought to continue a legacy, and in doing so, you have shown us its true face. And it is a face of sorrow." Caius buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent, wretched sobs. He was not a villain revealed, but a fool. A man who had played his part in a terrible story written long before he was born, believing himself the hero. His begging for forgiveness was the final, damning piece of Stillwater's legacy. Not just the physical deformities, but the profound, willful blindness that had perpetuated them. The damage was indeed done, and his tears could not wash it away. The cabin felt like a tomb, sealed by the weight of confessions and the fragile, struggling breaths of the newborn. Morwen's words and Caius's broken sobs had sucked the air from the room, leaving only the stark, unchangeable reality. The storm had passed, but the devastation it left behind was internal, a landscape of shattered traditions and irrevocable truths. Alara held her child, their child, hers and Caius's, the living embodiment of Stillwater's poisoned legacy. The infant's features, so tragically marked, were not monstrous to her now, but profoundly sorrowful. Each shallow breath, each mewling cry, was an accusation against the fear and isolation that had shaped its existence. The initial shock had cooled into a hard, clear-eyed resolve. This child would not be another secret buried in the high rocks or whispered about in hushed tones. Its life would not be a continuation of the silence. But what life could it have? The options laid before her were not paths, but precipices. To stay would be a war against the ingrained fear of every soul in Stillwater. She would have to fight for every scrap of acceptance, every moment of normalcy, for herself and her child. She would have to force them to look every day upon the consequence of their choices. It would be a life of relentless battle, and the child would be the banner she fought under, exposed to their pity, their revulsion, and their fear. Could she subject something so fragile to that? Could she win that war, or would they all be worn down into dust by it? To flee was to step into a vast and terrifying unknown. The world beyond the mountains was a myth, a place of stories about greed and sin. She had no money, no contacts, no knowledge of how to survive out there. The first snow was imminent. Travel with a newborn, especially one with such needs, would be perilous. It was a gamble with the highest stakes. a chance at freedom or a death sentence in the cold, unforgiving wilderness. And then there was Silas's offer. Her uncle, who understood the weight of this legacy better than anyone, had whispered it to her before she descended from his lean-to. "Give the child to me," he had said, his voice thick with a love that had been nurtured in solitude. "I will raise it hidden away. It will know kindness. It will know the birds and the sky. It will not know the fear in their eyes. I will protect it from all of this star." It was the old way, the Stillwater way, to hide the evidence, to love in secret, to spare the village its shame and the child its scorn. It would be a life of isolation, but a peaceful one. She could visit. She could stay in the village, unburdened, her secret safe with him. It was the easiest choice, the one that asked the least of everyone. It was also the choice that perpetuated the very cycle that had created this tragedy. To accept it would be to agree with Morwen, with Caius, with all of them, that the child was something to be concealed. Elara looked from her mother's tear-streaked face to the hunched, sobbing form of Caius, to the weary, defeated posture of Morwen. She looked at the tiny, flawed face of her son. Each option carried an immense emotional weight. Staying meant fighting a system of fear. Fleeing meant embracing terrifying uncertainty. Giving him to Silas meant condemning him to a hidden life, repeating the exact same pattern of shame and secrecy that had led to this moment. Her choice would not be about what was easiest. It would be about what broke the chain. The child stirred in her arms, its fused fingers brushing against the wool of its blanket. A fierce, protective love, sharper and more certain than any fear, surged through her. This child was innocent. It deserved more than to be a secret, a symbol, or a casualty. It deserved a chance at a life where it was not defined by the blood that had formed it. She knew then. The path was clear, and it was the hardest one of all. The silence in the cabin was a held breath, waiting for her to exhale a future. Elara looked at the faces around her. Agnes, shattered by decades of complicity. Caius, broken on the wheel of his own twisted duty. Morwen, hollowed out by the truth of the legacy he'd upheld. They were prisoners of Stillwater, of its fear, its secrets, its stone-walled isolation. They saw the child as a problem to be solved within the confines of the world they knew. A thing to be hidden, fought over, or fled from. She looked down at her son. In the gray dawn light, his features were a map of sorrow, but he was hers. His breath, however labored, was life. His existence was not a curse. It was a verdict. And the sentence was freedom. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stagnant air like a knife. All eyes turned to her. Agnes's weeping stilled. Caius looked up, his face a mess of confusion and hope. Morwen's weary gaze sharpened. "I will not stay and make him a spectacle for your guilt," she said, her words measured, her gaze sweeping over them. "I will not give him to the shadows to become another secret for you to keep. And I will not let this valley be his entire world." She shifted, wincing at the ache in her body, and held the child closer. A resolve, cold and hard as the mountains themselves, settled in her soul. "I am leaving, and I am taking him with me." A gasp came from Agnes. "Elara, the snow. The road is a river of mud. You have nothing. The child is too weak." "He is alive," Elara interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "And that is enough. I would rather he take his first breath of free air and his last on some unknown road than spend a single day living in the shadow of this place. I will not have him defined by your pact, or your fear, or your crooked blood. His legacy will not be Stillwater's. It will be his own." She looked at Silas, who had appeared silently in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. His intelligent eyes met hers, and in them she saw not judgment, but a deep, aching understanding. He gave a single, slow nod. He knew she was choosing the path he had never been offered. "I will find a place," she said, the words a vow spoken to the child in her arms, to herself, to the future. "A place where they have never heard of blood pacts or whispering stones. A place where he can just be a child. It will not be easy, But it will be clean. It will be free of this. She began to move, the decision lending her a strength she didn't know she possessed. With Agnes's help, she dressed in her warmest clothes and wrapped the infant in every blanket they could find. She took a little bread, a skin of water, a knife. She took nothing that would tie her to this place, no family heirlooms, no tokens of remembrance. She was shedding still water like a skin. The villagers, those who had not slunk away in shame, watched from a distance as she stepped out of the cabin. They did not approach. They did not offer help or well wishes. They simply watched, their faces a mixture of horror, pity, and a strange, reluctant awe. She was doing what none of them had ever dared, turning her back on the only world they had ever known. She did not look back at the cabin, at her mother's devastated face, at the forge where Caius's twisted sense of duty had been born. She walked past them all, her head high, her steps firm despite her weakness, the child a small, warm weight against her chest. She took the road not down toward the village, but up, toward the pass that led out of the valley. The mud sucked at her boots, and the cold bit at her face, but the air felt different already. It was the air of the world. Behind her, still water was left in a quiet deeper than any it had known. The storm had broken more than the sky. It had broken the silence. The truth was out, lying amongst them like a corpse they would now have to live with. There was no resolution, only the lingering, uncomfortable weight of their dark legacy. They were left to grapple with it, in the echoing silence of Alara's departure. She walked away from it all, toward the first snow and the vast, unknown world beyond. A mother and her child on a new path, leaving the curse of the past buried in the valley they would never see again.